Hi, my name is Jennifer Schwartz, and I'm the facilitator for our session on language. Thanks for joining us. We have two great presenters. We have Matthew McCullough with the Office of Disability Rights out of Washington, D.C., and Brian Dennis out of Iowa Workforce Development in Des Moines. I am a white female, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm really excited about our session today. I'm going to hand it over to both of our presenters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our session. My name is Brian Dennis with Iowa Workforce Development. I am an African-American male wearing a bluish-gray checkered shirt, and my pronouns are he and his. And it's my pleasure to also introduce and hand this over to my esteemed co-presenter, Matthew McCullough.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew McLeod, and I am a proud Filipino American with cerebral palsy. I am wearing a purple dress shirt with a purple and white striped tie that matches the shirt. My pronouns are he, his. I am extremely honored and it's a great pleasure to be speaking with all of you. Here, I want to thank Senator Harkin and the Harkin Institute for inviting me to this esteemed event. So we're going to spend the next hour, Brian Dennis and myself, speaking about why is it important to use appropriate language when we are working with the disability community. As you can tell, I'm also a person with a disability. I was born with cerebral palsy, and including what Ms. Schwartz mentioned, I do work in Washington, D.C., and I manage the ED compliance office for the district government. And as you know, Senator Harkin was one of the team leaders that passed the ADA 31 years ago. So, and part of that endeavor was to ensure that people were treated with respect and were referred with great integrity and stuff like that. So I'm going to begin with my presentation about why it's important to include proper language. And so companies and government orgs have trouble understanding what's the proper language to use, and of course language actually evolves over time. And as we started this session, you were asked to come up with the most modern terms for certain language, such as previously people used the term handicap, and so that's not necessarily the most up-to-date term being used today, and so people with disabilities is the most appropriate term to use. And so it's so important to have different companies and governments to recognize that they need to be culturally competent in recognizing that the disability community is highly diverse, and that language really matters, because using proper language means you're truly valuing the person that you're speaking with or serving. And so in terms of my line of work, my employees and I truly recognize that working with other government agencies and having them understand that using people first language is critical to the overall success of our for the government. And so that's the reason why we want to use appropriate language to be inclusive, because at the end of the day, if you offend or do not recognize that when using appropriate language to reference someone, chances are they will be turned off and not listen to us or receive the appropriate services that they need in terms of improving their quality of life. And so the question is, how do we, what are the best approaches to working with people that have impairments or limitations? Well, first of all, you need to listen. And if you have a question about how to reference a person, you should simply ask them, how would you like to be referred as? And normally, you should always start with the person's name. And of course, if they're willing to disclose their disability, that's their choice, and that can also help open up the overall conversation of being inclusive, because having disability is only one element of a person. It doesn't define them, and so understanding how to refer to a person, such as I'm a person with cerebral palsy, so you wouldn't call me a CP person. You would refer to me as person with cerebral palsy. However, you also need to understand that we live in a world that certain populations they have their own culture. For example, we often use the term person with autism, but if you interact with a person with autism and ask, would you want to be referred as person with autism? In many cases, they would come back and say, I want to be known as an autistic person. So you need to engage in that conversation and recognizing those approaches that using people first language does not always apply to each and every person. They have a way of being wanting to be identified. So it's critical to have that effective communication with the person, so you understand how to interact with them going forward. And and knowing that language constantly evolves over time, there's an ongoing education for everybody involved. So let's, for example, I use the term handicap. People don't necessarily understand where the term handicap came from. Originally, the term handicap came from after World War II, when all the veterans came home. The United States was not fully prepared to reintegrate the veterans that had limitations or impairments. And so many of those veterans had to beg on the street, hand and cap. And so that's where the term handicap came from. And so those terms, those outdated terms, have a historic meaning to them. Excuse me. That many people simply do not know. So, but over time, as the movement for independence came along, the language eventually evolved to people with disabilities, and so once again, language evolves. So there's definitely an education learning curve for people that may not interact with our community on a day-to-day basis. I would argue that when people with disabilities know that the person that's that's a cost for them. They may not know the proper terms. I would encourage all people with disabilities try to exercise patience and simply generally educate them on the proper terms that they should be using to be more culturally competent, and not only that, more culturally linguistic competent as well. However, there are certain things that the companies and governments officials should avoid, that they should make assumptions about people with disabilities. So, for example, current assumptions, knowing that you can see my cerebral palsy impacts my ability to move and speak. However, my disability does not impact my ability, my mind, and so there are certain assumptions that if a person sees another person's disability, that impacts their mind or how they see the world around them. And so those types of assumptions should be avoided at all times. And that the more you get to know a person with a disability one-on-one, those are assumptions generally disappear, or that the person goes through a learning curve that wasn't necessarily there before. And then that's important because the more conversations, the more true conversations that occur among people with and without disabilities, that really allows people to truly understand each other, and it also integrates the whole community, includes people with and without disabilities, and share a common understanding among each other. And so if you don't use inclusive language, in people first language, it definitely impacts how certain situations go forward. So I'm going to use my position in government, that people with disabilities want to be in a community with the appropriate long-term supports and services. However, if the government officials do not recognize that they're not using the proper language to simply invite the citizens with disabilities and the families into the government circle, that chances are the relationship will be strained, simply because if you don't use the proper language, there's a level of disrespect that may occur between government official and the citizen with the disability and the family. And so my agency works a lot with other government officials to make sure that they understand the importance of using proper terms, and such as not using mental retardation, but using the term intellectual disability. And for some of you, the change in language in terms of the R word came back in 2012, when a young lady with Down syndrome lobbied that she didn't want to be referred as retarded, that there was a law that Congress passed back in 2012 known as the Rosa Law. And so you could see the impact of our advocates when it displays in trying to change the culture in terms of language and in terms of Rosa's law that changed the term mental retardation to the term intellectual disability is a prime example of the strength that advocates can have to change language all the way out to the policy level. And so I want to pretty much end there, and I have a video that I want to share with you that my agency created over the past several years, dealing with sensitivity, and a lot of companies have been wanting to use this video for their own training purposes, and so I wanted to share this 5-minute video with you. So with this in mind, I'm going to play this video.
Good morning, Bob.
Morning there, big man. Morning, Alice!
There's no need to be awkward.
Poor Bob. Like so many of us, he just doesn't know how to interact with people with disabilities.
It's pretty easy, really. People with disabilities are people first.
We need the same things that every person needs, like respect.
Good morning, everyone.
Attention! Okay. Maybe we need to be more specific.
The easiest way to show respect is to focus on the person, not the disability. It's okay. You'll get the hang of it.
One easy way to focus on the person is to watch the person signing and not their interpreter.
Or their companion.
It's really cool that you'd like to help, but do us both a favor and please ask me first. What you think might be helping?
I got you.
Wait, ah! Oh no, might actually not.
If you'd like to offer me help, let me hold on to your elbow. Don't take mine.
Hey, would you like to take my arm?
Sure.
Assistive devices help us to live our lives. They're really important and really personal.
Grabbing them only makes it weird for everyone.
What?
Please only touch our devices and service animals if we've given you permission. And don't take it personally if I ask you not to. Remember that my service animal helps me all the time. Neither of us would like it if we were separated.
Remember, we make our own decisions. We sign documents, vote, volunteer, work, and pay taxes.
We get married.
So don't address me just because I have a great smile.
Just because I'm blind.
May I help you?
Does not mean I'm deaf.
I don't know. I think he said he was going to come. Just because I'm deaf doesn't mean I'm blind.
And just because I use a wheelchair doesn't mean that I can't sweep you off your feet.
So take a deep breath. Relax. We don't bite.
Unless we're really hungry.
Hello there, ladies. How are you?
Hello. And if you're not sure what to do, just ask.
Hi, would you still like to see a menu?
No thanks, but can you please read it to me?
Sure, definitely.
Just treat us the way you would want to be treated, and we'll all be okay.
morning. Good morning. Morning, Alice.
Morning.
Awkward no more. Nice job, Bob. Go forth and be human.
There's no need to be awkward.
Now we're back, and so hopefully my presentation was quite educational. I have the honor of introducing Brian Dennis, who's from Iowa originally, and he works very closely with the district community about dealing with supporting employment and stuff like that. So I have great respect for Mr. Dennis in terms of making sure that citizens with disabilities get employment, not only that, competitive employment that's integrated. And so with that in mind, Brian, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. First off, I want to again thank my co-presenter, Matthew, and that was an excellent introduction to our presentation. I want to thank everyone who is joining us for our virtual presentation. As I said, my name is Brian Dennis, and I am the Disability Services Program Manager for Iowa Workforce Development, which means I spend a lot of my day and a lot of my time working with individuals and employers regarding the inclusion of persons with disabilities in all aspects of our lives, but especially in the world of employment. And that's really what I'm passionate about. And that's one of the reasons I'm speaking to you today is how can we be more inclusive of serving individuals and bringing them in to our places of employment. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about is why does this all matter? Why do words matter? And primarily the reason that words matter is that we live in a time that the language that we use is truthfully a moving target. And I don't think ever before have we lived in a time where the words that we use are as important, but also sometimes the words that we use fall in the area of a bit of gray. We're not exactly what we should say, how we should say it, what's the best way to communicate with each other. It's not a shock that we live in a time that identity truthfully is being recognized as one of the biggest parts of a person's culture. And we want to be diverse, we want to be equitable, we want to be inclusive. And language sits at the core of those things. However, we also need to understand that every person is many things. So every person has lots of different identities that they wear, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, and yes, their disability status. And of all those cultures, disability is going to be the one that you're going to see across all sectors. All right. Every person, if they live long enough, is going to experience a disability. They're going to encounter a disability. You know why? Because our bodies are machines. And given enough time, something with that machine is going to learn to function differently. It may happen at birth, it may happen when we're older, and it may happen any time in our lifetimes. So as we're doing this, we really, as a community, and especially in our places of employment, because employment is where we are empowered. Employment is where we earn money, where we make friends, where we really become included in our communities. We want to make sure that our employers are really ready to be inclusive of all communities, including persons with a disability. So one of the things that we really want to acknowledge and start off with was, while we want to make sure that we're saying the right things, if there is a perfect thing, which there isn't, we really want to talk about things we really want to avoid. And one of the first things we want to take into account of avoiding is using any terms that place a person who experiences a disability in an unfavorable or step down position. And that's really easy to do just by using phrases that we don't use anymore, or about phrases that have a stigma or a negative connotation with it. So some of the first ones to avoid would be using things like suffer. Okay, having a disability is part of a person's identity, just like their gender and anything else. So a person who experiences a disability, a small piece of them is their disability. It may be what you notice first, but it very well may not be something that is at the core of who they are. And even if it is, it's part of them. And we wouldn't say that a person suffers because of their gender. We wouldn't say a person suffers because of their race or ethnicity. So no one suffers because of having a disability. Another piece of it will be using things like bound. Bound makes it sound like you're trapped. So while you can't tell by the video, I use a wheelchair. And again, it's part of my life experience. I'm not bound to it that it is somehow thrust upon me or some type of punishment. It's just a part of who I am. And then other things would be just using terms that we really don't use anymore. You heard my co-presenter Matt mention a few of them. One of the big ones is the idea of using the term of mental retardation. That's a really antiquated term, and it's a term that has a lot of negative connotation. It's been used as an insult for many, many years. So we don't hear it as much as we used to, but even if you're not sure, the idea of a person being the term mental retardation, or even MR, the acronym, you really want to phase that out and use the term intellectual disability, or ID. That's really become the phrasing. Another big piece of it is, we'll talk about this more here in a moment, is the idea of the term impaired or having some type of impairment. Again, impaired, impairment, that does sound, again, like a person is somehow punished or less than, or having a step down position. So you want to make sure that you don't use things like impaired. One of the common ones that people say are things like hearing impaired. And we're going to talk about here in a moment when we talk about the idea of person first language. But again, everything that we're going to talk about when it comes to language it's a moving target. And understand that the vernacular, the phrasing, the wording that we use in 2021, in 2022, in 2023, it may change. And again, it's also going to default to personal choice, all right, to personal identity. Every single individual is going to be a different person, and we want to approach them in a respectful, individualized fashion. But we are going to talk about, during the rest of my time today, are some helpful hints to look at things on a macro level, but you always need to understand that you want to use the term that a person prefers to be to utilize when it comes to them. All right. So one of the first things we start out with language when it comes to person who experiences a disability is the idea of person first language. And what are the terms and the phrasing that we use? So Matt spoke about this when he brought the term of handicapped. And as you heard him explain, handicapped historically has been used of, again, saying a person is somehow damaged or less than. We talk about handicapping races and handicapping horse races and handicapping things in sports. But we really don't use that when it comes to individuals. And as a general rule, you don't want to use the term handicap. Instead of handicap, you really have a couple options. And these options are really defined by who or what you're referring to. So if we're referring to a what, an item, an object, the term isn't handicap, the term would be accessible. So let's take an example. Again, you can't tell from on screen, but I use a wheelchair. So because I use a wheelchair, I have a placard that I have in my vehicle that I hang from my car window that allows me to park in the accessible parking space. All right, not the handicap spot or the handicap space, it's the accessible parking space. And that really makes sense if you think about it. If you park in the parking space, if we use the term handicap, which again, we don't use it anymore, but handicap means that there's some type of disability, correct? Is there a handicap, in quotation marks, is there a handicap with the parking spot? No, the parking spot is just closer so that I don't have to wheel as far. For folks that are walking but maybe have some ambulatory issue, how far they can walk. It's hard to walk. It's painful to walk. We want to give those individuals closer parking spots. I've gone to many a store and there's a closer parking spot for individuals who are pregnant or with newborns. Again, because it's easier to get there. It makes entering the office, the store, the building, your job easier, so it makes it more accessible. All right. So again, if we're talking about a thing, it's accessible. All right. You hear this a lot with things such as assistive technology makes processes accessible. If we're talking about an individual, then you want to use the concept of person first language. And Matt again spoke about this briefly. Person first language is exactly how it sounds. We want to see the person before we see anything else about them. We want to see the person before we see the disability. The big part, the most important part of anyone's identity is that they are a person. So typically, again, you would say person with a, and then followed by whatever be relevant to the individual. So the catch-all is person with a disability. If you don't get specific, person with a disability. To use Brian as an example, you would say person who uses a wheelchair, not wheelchair bound, not suffers because of a wheelchair. A person who experiences a mental health concern, not a person who is crazy, not a person who suffers. And you really don't want to even use the term of mental illness. That the term would be mental health, and you could say a mental health concern. Now, the idea of saying person first language is accurate for most populations, but there are some exceptions. Matt spoke about individuals who experience autism or who are not neurotypical. Again, you should really rely on what the person identifies with, but with that very specific group, we're starting to see more and more often, instead of using the term person with autism, they would like to be referred to as an autistic person. It is their community, it is their experience, it is their identity, and we should respect that and follow through with that. Again, you may want to double check with the person that you're working with, but again, we are beginning to see autistic people or person become preferred over person with autism or people with autism. Another group that you would see this happen with is persons who experience deafness, individuals with low to no hearing. Now, this is a very specific group where even the term deaf has different connotations. It is not a community I represent, but is what I've been taught over time. So when you look at the identity or the phrase deaf, it really can be two different things. There's little d deaf and big D deaf. So little d deaf it refers to the actual experience of having low to no hearing. But we really want to make sure that we understand that on top of little d deaf, which is the diagnosis, you have the culture, which is big D deaf. And culturally, big D deaf does not even necessarily consider itself a disability group as much as it is another life experience. So persons who experience deafness prefer to use the terms deaf or hard of hearing. Now, hard of hearing may sound like an old term, but it is preferred by the community over hearing impaired. In fact, the term hearing impaired could be considered an insult. So I would really strongly caution you to not use the term hearing impaired. The term deaf is typically used for individuals who have no hearing. Hard of hearing is used primarily for individuals who have reduced hearing. And again, to catch both sides of it, simply say deaf or hard of hearing. And as always, we want to default to the leadership of the individual when it comes to those things. Now, all language is in flux. All language moves. And you may have individuals who experience more than one disability. A big part of understanding the use of person-first language, or any language, any minority group, and person with disabilities are the single largest minority group in our country, in the world actually, is the idea that sometimes you're going to get it wrong. And because you understand you're sometimes going to get it wrong, have an open conversation. We want to talk about this more. We look at how can we make our organizations, our employment, much more inclusive. But understand that if you start off with the idea of not looking at it from perspective, that having a disability means that there's something wrong with you, you are somehow broken, you need fixed, you need to be handled with kid gloves. Those things, once you change the mentality and understand that disability is another part of life, it's a part of life that will touch most of us in some way, shape, or form, you start to open the door of thinking things through in a much more inclusive fashion. Another question that sometimes comes up with this is, where do I go for information? Who can help me with this? I'm in business to do this, I'm in business to do that, but I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing and I want to go to the experts. Well, there are several different layers of experts if you want to look at it like that. Number one is starting with the community that you're wanting to connect with. There are a variety of nonprofit organizations community-based organizations, and state agencies that provide not only this information, but also have a strong connection and relationship with the disability community, and very oftentimes very specific disabilities. So for individuals who are low to no vision, Iowa Department for the Blind can be a really good partner and resource. Groups such as the Epilepsy Foundation for individuals who experience seizure, Voc Rehab, or Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services, their full name, does a lot of work with different disability groups. You're going to have groups like the Spinal Cord Alliance, and really NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is a really strong organization when it comes to working with individuals who have a mental health concern. And again, speaking to that particular group. You will never be experts on all things other than your own business. However, like anything else, part of your business is being open to your customer base. And whatever your business is, your customer base are all individuals. And your customer base also needs to reflect it in your employee base, which again is going to be all individuals. Another big part to this process is, how do we start out? We want to make sure we're inclusive. We want to make sure that we're understanding. We want to make sure that we're equitable. We want to make sure that we're doing all things not only legally, but also have the best idea of serving our community, of being a good, strong employer. And what can we do to start that process? One of the first things you can do to be inclusive is understanding that you need to really have two pieces to create your inclusivity model: the idea of a champion and the idea of a broker. And I'll explain what those two things are. So a champion is someone within your organization that is passionate about this type of work, that is passionate about being inclusive. All right, whether that is inclusivity for persons with disabilities, for minorities, of any and all forms, is who is a champion, who is a person that really wants to make sure that the organization is doing the good, right thing when it comes to this. And by the way, don't make it one person's job. All right. We never want to have an organization that diversity falls underneath the umbrella of the person who have to have diversity in their job title potentially and no one else. Right. So you want to make sure that organizationally you have multiple individuals that care and are passionate and are supported. But the best way to do it is to have a leader who internally is the champion, someone of some level of power or direction, high level, that really wants to spearhead this type of work. But to make this really work, on top of having a champion, you need a broker. And a broker is a person who typically represents the population that you serve, that represents the group that you want to make sure that you're more inclusive of, but also understands how your organization works, understands your business model, understands your customer base, understand what you're wanting to get done. Kind of a Jack or Jill of both trades. But that's really the first place that you start off, is having that first two touch points. And this will not be only two people doing this, but making sure that you have a champion, to make sure that there's true buy-in from the organization, and a broker who can understand the culture of the group that you're looking for. Other things you need to do as far as having an inclusive employment strategy is looking at your organization and making sure that you are truly accessible, both physically and programmatically. Now, the physical part of it is sometimes the easier piece, because those are the things that are up front facing us and that are visible. All right. Again, to keep bringing myself into this, did I use a wheelchair? Can I get into your building? Can I get into your spaces? What is the accessible parking? Are there ramps? Are there elevators if your building is more than one floor? All those ADA prescribed things, but also understand that the ADA sets a great standard, but you really should look at expanding it beyond the ADA. The ADA is minimally, this is what we want to do, and that's great, but we also want to see, are there things additionally that we can do? How much can we really be inclusive? But making sure you have those things, because you don't want there to be a physical barrier to, again, your job as an employer. The next piece is the programmatic or the cultural aspects of being an inclusive employer. What are those things that really sets the vibe, set the mood, those things that are oftentimes invisible or unseen. Language is a big part of that. Language is a big part of it. How do we refer to individuals? How do we engage individuals? Do we give individuals time? Do we give individuals space? Is our environment a safe place if you experience life differently? And there's lots of ways that we can experience life differently. Then having those groups that I mentioned earlier on board to help you. Doing your outreach to Vocal Rehab and Iowa Department for the Blind, doing your outreach to those support groups, involving them in things such as your hiring aspects. Many individuals may need American Sign Language. Are those things that you have ready and available? All right. Do you have those things that can be done either in person or virtually at hand very quickly? All right. Do you have an environment where if a person has a vision limitation, they can navigate it? Again, I spoke about myself and things as a physical disability. Are there various ways to communicate? If a person experiencing an intellectual disability, a developmental disability, if they're a person who identifies as an autistic person, can people learn differently? Can they express themselves differently? Can they work differently? One of the great things that's happened in the face of the pandemic that rocked our planet is we've learned how to work differently. We've learned how to work virtually. We've learned how to job share. We've learned how to make our schedules much more flexible, our workspaces much more flexible. And we've learned to do these things without major drops in productivity. We've learned to do these things while pushing forward with meeting our bottom line. We've learned to do these things because these are necessary. And we all know that also in the face of the pandemic, it does not take much looking to see that we need people, right? It doesn't take me much time in my vehicle to see help wanted signs. You would speak of this a lot better than me. And understand that because persons with a disability are the largest minority group in our country, they're the largest untapped group of potential employees in our country, on our planet. So that inclusiveness taps into a job pool, a job seeker pool, an employee pool that you may not have access or may not have access to as fully as you can, as full as you want to. These things will help you truthfully become more inclusive. Also, look at who you're hiring, who are in leadership positions, who are around the table when you're creating these strategies. There's always been a saying of nothing about us without us. And this is really that as well. So as you're sitting in your planning meetings, your strategic groups, your whatever organizational committees that you have to really roll out these ideas, are the individuals you're trying to engage with at the table? Have you invited them? And is that invitation sincere? Look at the folks you already have working for you. You all have great minds and great talent already with the organization that are going to know many things I've talked about, represent the communities that I've talked about. That way, Matt and I only touched on a few of the different communities that represented by experiencing a disability. Are those folks part of these plans? All right. Ask the community, how can we better engage with you? How can we better help you? How can we make our environment better for you to get your job done? Like anything else, it's a top-down process that also takes information from the boots on the ground up to the higher level. All those things really help make your organization inclusive and, again, really working together. Because as a community, we can accomplish many, many great things. So with that, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending our virtual sessions. I would like to have a big word of thanks to my co-presenter, Matthew McCullough. I also want to thank Jen Schwartz, who is our session facilitator. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you again.